Okay, once again, we'd like to turn to Genesis 32. Again, we'll be looking at verses 22 through 32. We've already read it, so we'll just read verse 24. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. So coming to, as we've already seen, coming to Genesis 32, Jacob, after 20 years, is on his way back home. He enters his brother's land, and he sends some messengers ahead to meet Esau, hoping to appease him. And Esau is coming in his direction with 400 men, and this news greatly distresses Jacob, and he prays in verses 9 through 12, and then following his prayer, he sends these gifts ahead in hope to appease Esau, and we see that in verse 20. In verse 21, Jacob lodged that night in the company, but still afraid, still distressed. He got up in the evening, sent his family across Jabbok, and we see that in verses 22 and 23. And then we come to verse 24, and Jacob was left alone. He's on the banks of Jabbok, which was a stream that intersected the mountain range of Gilead and emptied into the Jordan River. Jacob was left alone. Jacob, up to this point, had lived his life his way, for his own ends, and he's alone. Jacob, up to this point, was working all the angles, and God, in his providence, is working for the benefit of Jacob. And now Jacob is alone. Again, God is going to do a work upon Jacob. So there's Jacob. He's lived his life his way, for his own ends, alone. The one who tried everything in his own strength, making his own way, living by his own wits, never fully trusting in the Lord for anything, never fully surrendering to the Lord. And God makes sure that at this point, he's alone. He's the one who's always depended upon himself. He's sufficient, self-sufficient. He's proud. And he's alone. And again, it was God who had arranged for Jacob to be alone, because God was going to do a work upon this one who has been given to conniving, and pretending, and planning, and insisting upon his own ways, and refusing to submit to God. God would now bring Jacob from his ways to clinging to God. And that's our subject. From resistance to clinging. From resistance to clinging. We want to notice several things that happened that night. There was a personal meeting with God. God came where Jacob was. And there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. A very close, a very personal meeting between God and Jacob. Now it's important, verse 24, to notice at this point, Jacob was not wrestling to obtain a blessing. Now I realize in Hosea 10:4 or 12:4 that it is presented Jacob is prevailing over the angel. That happens later when he said, I will not let thee go except thou bless me. That is the result of God wrestling with Jacob. So it is God wrestling with Jacob at this point, and not Jacob wrestling with God to obtain a blessing. So the heavenly visitor, which is Christ, wrestling with Jacob, and he's doing so for a specific reason. At this point, Jacob is not trying to obtain anything from the angel. It is God bringing Jacob to a point where all he can do is cling. So God is dealing with the unsurrendered and resisting Jacob. At this point, God is not a dominating factor in the life of Jacob. Notice verse 25. Prevailed not against him. Why? Jacob was resisting. Jacob was resisting. Though Jacob had had a past experience of God 20 years ago in Bethel, and though he was personally aware of the promise of God, and though he had been abundantly blessed by God, and though he had sought God through prayer, and though he was willing to give up certain things, he gave all those gifts to Esau, he was willing to give up certain things, he was willing to surrender many things, he's still struggling against and resisting God. You and I can give things. We can be willing to give things. We can be willing to give all that we have without giving ourselves. And it means nothing until we give ourselves. So there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And many, just like Jacob, have had a past experience of God. They are aware of the promises of God. They have been blessed by God. They are willing to give up certain things. But just like Jacob, they continue in their own way to struggle and to resist God. And what is needed is a face-to-face meeting with God, where God brings us where we need to be. Most do not want, they have no desire for such a meeting with God. But we must desire. We ought to long for that meeting where God brings us to where we need to be. So what did God do? He brought Jacob to the end of himself. God came to where Jacob was for this purpose, to bring Jacob to the end of himself. Do we long for God to come where we are and bring us to the end of ourselves? to bring us to the end of all our struggling and all of our resistance against God. Do we want that? Do we desire for that to happen? There wrestled a man with him until the breaking of day. And again, it's stated in verse 25, he prevailed not against him. So Jacob is resisting. Jacob is struggling. We do so in many ways. We do so in a variety of ways. We resist God in a variety of ways. You don't just have to stand up and say, "No, God, I'm not going to do that." You can resist in many, many, many different ways. He's struggling. He's bucking against God. And God knew and God saw that Jacob, left to himself, is not going to quit in his resistance. And left to ourselves, we won't either. We will continue to struggle. We will continually to resist God. That's why we ought to long for this meeting with God. We're told in verse 25 that he touched the hollow of his thigh. The result, in the hollow of his thigh was out of joint. Now that angel could have done that at any time. Could have done it right at the beginning, but he didn't. With a simple touch, Jacob's hip is out of place. Now keep in mind, he could have destroyed Jacob, but he didn't. All he did was touch the hollow of his thigh, and he did so graciously and lovingly, and the hollow of his thigh was out of joint. God in grace, God in mercy, overcomes and conquers Jacob. That's never a bad thing. When God overcomes us and conquers us. But we fight against that. We resist and will continue to do so if left to ourselves. So those words, the hollow of his thigh was out of joint, speak of the fact that Jacob's ability and his strength to resist is taken away. Jacob no longer has strength to resist. He no longer has the ability. Jacob's power to resist and continue to wrestle were gone. So he's brought to the place where he can no longer resist. He can no longer depend upon his own strength. Again, we must ask, do we desire that God would bring us to the place where we can no longer resist? When was the last time you asked God, Lord, bring me to the place where I can no longer resist you? Have we ever asked God for that? No, probably haven't. No longer depend upon our own strength. No longer depend upon our own wits. He is brought to realize he's helpless. He's brought to realize his nothingness. Do we desire that? Jacob is brought to the place where he realizes that his way does not work and his way is not going to work. Do we desire that? Do we desire that God would break all of our resistance? We resist God without even knowing we're resisting God. Do we desire that God would break all of our resistance against Him? Do we desire a meeting with God that results in us being completely conquered by God? Do we want that? That's what happened to Jacob. God can do that anytime He pleases. But that's not the question. That's not the issue. The question is, do we want that? That's the issue. Jacob is brought to the place of absolute surrender. Verse 26, the angel says, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." And this is where Hosea would come in, what is stated there in chapter 12, verse 4. And he said, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." Jacob is brought to the place where all he can do is cling and plead with God. I will not let thee go. With his hip dislocated, again his strength is taken away, Jacob realizes the greatness of God. And now he leans his weight upon Him. He clings, he lays hold of God, refusing to let go. Oh, that we would be brought to the place where we're willing to let go of our own way and refusing to let go of God. We're more prone to let go of God than we are to let go of our own way. Oh, to be brought to this point. So there's Jacob. His thigh out of joint, his hips out of joint. At this point he realizes, God is greater than me. You say, well, everybody realizes. Oh, no, they don't. We don't realize it many, many times. God is greater than me. When we go into panic mode, it's because we've stopped believing that God is greater than whatever it is we're panicking about. So he now lays hold of God. When will we lay hold of God? When we realize His greatness. When we realize that He is greater than us, we lay hold of God. And if we're not laying hold of God, it's because we don't realize that. He refuses to let go. He realizes that God is greater than himself. He realizes that God's ways are superior to his own. Do we believe that? Do we believe that God knows better than we do? I'm afraid there's an awful lot of God's people who don't believe that. Do we believe God is sufficient? Do we desire for God to show us His greatness and to reveal to us our weakness? That can be very painful. When he touched the hollow of his thigh and his hip went out of joint, guess what? Jacob experienced some pain at that moment. It's a painful thing. And now all he can do is lean his weight upon this angel. So Jacob, with his hip dislocated, is brought to the place where all he can do is hold on to God and cling to God. That's why you and I need trials in our life, because we're so twisted that that's the only time we're likely, and even then we may not. It's the only time we're likely to hold on to God and not let go. Do we desire to be brought to such a position? Jacob is brought to plead with God. Verse 26, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. So with his hip dislocated, he realizes the greatness of God. this hip dislocated, all Jacob could do was hold on to God and cry out for a blessing. By crying out for a blessing, Jacob was acknowledging that God was greater than him and that God had what he needed and that God's ways were superior to his own ways. He realized that only God could provide the blessing he so desperately needed. Jacob that night realized he didn't have anywhere else to go but to the Lord. When you come to the realization that the only place you can go is God, guess where you're going? You're going to go to the Lord. We need to be brought to that place. Jacob is brought to repentance. There is no surrender. There is no going from unsurrendered to clinging without repentance. Notice verse 27. And he said unto him, the angel said unto Jacob, what is thy name? What is thy name? This question from God to Jacob. What is thy name? Very significant question. What is thy name? It serves as a reminder of Jacob's sin. In chapter 27, let's go over there. When Jacob went in to deceive his father asked him in verse 18, Genesis 27, verse 18. And he came unto his father and said, my father. He said, here am I. Who art thou, my son? Who art thou, my son? And now the angel, God, asks Jacob, what is thy name? Notice verse 19 of Genesis 27. And Jacob said unto his father, I am Esau. And now God asks him, what is your name? He's reminding Jacob of where it all began. This is why you've got the problems you have. He's reminding him of his sin. He told his father, I am Esau, thy firstborn. And now God says, what is thy name? Notice verse 24 of Genesis 27. And he said, art thou my very son Esau? And he said, I am. Reminded Jacob of his lies, of his deceit, before we'll ever completely surrender and cling to God. We have to get back to the root matters. Most aren't willing to do that. Most would do anything to avoid that. But we need God to bring us to that point. Art thou my very son Esau? And Jacob says, I am. And now God says, what is thy name? With this question, what is thy name? Jacob is brought face to face with his sin. And I want to say that caused him more pain than the hip out of joint. What is thy name? He's not only brought face to face with his sin, but he's brought face to face with who he is. We convince ourselves that we are somebody that we're not many times. The name Jacob means user. Imagine naming your kid, your child, a name that signifies he's going to be a user, he's going to be a usurper, he's going to be a deceiver. He's going to be a supplanter and a contender. Listen to what Genesis 27:36. Hear what Esau says concerning his brother, Jacob. Genesis 27, verse 36. And he said, "Is not he rightly named Jacob? For he hath supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright." Esau says he's rightly named Jacob. And now God says, what is your name? What is your name? Who are you? And Jacob answers, Jacob. Verse 27, and he said, of Genesis 32, and he said, Jacob. So God is reminding Jacob of his sin, bringing him back to that day when he lied to his father. I'm Esau. Are you my son Esau? I am. And God says, what is your name? Reminding him of his sin. But perhaps even worse than that, he reminds Jacob of who he is. You're a usurper. You're a deceiver. So we hear Jacob say, Jacob. Jacob had to take an honest and painful look at himself. Most don't want to do that. Most will do anything to avoid that. Who are we? Who am I? Do we desire for God to bring us to the place where we're forced to take an honest look at ourselves? How many times you see on the news someone's child, be an adult child, can be an adolescent, doesn't matter. They've been accused of a crime or they've committed a crime. And mom gets on TV and dad gets on TV and the aunts and the uncles and the cousins, oh, he would never do that. He would never do that. And they will never admit what their son or what their daughter is. Every now and then, you'll hear a parent get on there and tell it just like it is. But it's rare. It's extremely rare. And even rarer yet is when we have to face who we are. I'm Jacob. I'm Jacob. That's not a name to be proud of. I'm Jacob. I'm Jacob. All of this brought about the transformation of Jacob. Verse 28, and he said, this is God speaking, the angel, thy name shall be called no more Jacob. I love those 3 words. No more Jacob. No more. Jacob, no more. No more Jacob, but Israel. And you, on your own time, go through the book of Genesis and look at when Jacob is called Israel and when he's called Jacob. Israel's the new man. Jacob's the old. No more Jacob. Jacob is brought to surrender. and he's transformed. From Jacob to Israel. No more Jacob. What that means is the course of his life was altered. Do we desire that? There's times when our course needs to be altered. God can alter it. He certainly can. And we need to ask God to do so. No more Jacob. There was a change in his character. See, people all the time try to make changes in their life, but they fail over and over and over again. You know why? Because their character doesn't change. They are who they are. And until that changes, nothing really changes. But here there was a character change. No more Jacob. No more Jacob. His life was changed. There was a change in his ideas. There was a change in his outlook. There was a change in his purposes. This is what surrender will do. There will be a change of character. When we surrender, we change. Jacob came out of this meeting different than he entered. You see, we're very accustomed to meeting with God in a church worship service and going out unchanged. That's our way. Go to church every Sunday. And most of the time, people walk out the door the same condition they walked in. You say, well, I came in a good condition. Well, you ought to go out in a better. There ought to always be a change. And I believe there is when there's a real meeting with God. Jacob came out of this meeting different than he entered. Notice verse 30. He says, I have seen God face to face. Jacob saw God. We need a meeting with God where we can say, I saw God. I saw the Lord. And there's no doubt about it because we were face to face. Notice verse 31. He passed over Peniel. It was a Passover experience. We pass over a lot of things. We're able to pass over a lot of things when surrendered. Then we read, the sun rose upon him. It was the beginning of a new day. And when you and I surrender to God, when all we can do is cling, it's the beginning of a new day. It's a new day. It's not ever going to be a new day until it's no more Jacob. I'm going to change this. I'm going to change that. No, you're not. Until you're no more Jacob. Then notice, and he halted. He limped upon his thigh. God's mark was upon his life. I believe Jacob limped the rest of his life. God's mark was upon him. His walk evidenced the fact that God had conquered him. Every time he limped across the field, it was a reminder of that day, that evening, when God conquered Jacob. We ought to desire to be God conquered. To be God conquered. God can conquer us. But do we desire it? do we truly desire? In closing, it's declared in verse 29, and he, God, blessed him, Jacob, there. When God brings us from resistance to God, to clinging to God, we're blessed. We're blessed. It's one of the highest blessings there is, to be brought from ourselves to God. God blessed him there after a personal meeting with God. The question is, I know we all desire God's blessings. But see, when we think of blessings, we just think of good thing. Well, this is a good thing, but we don't think of it that way. Are we desirous of God blessing us by conquering our life? By putting an end to all of our resistance, to all of our struggling against God? We need to ask ourselves, why? Why do I struggle against God? Why do I resist God? The answer to that question is found in the other question. What is your name? Who are you? The reason we struggle, the reason we resist God is because that's who we are. We all have to say, I'm Jacob. I'm Jacob. That ought to cause us great shame. Oh, for God to put away the Jacob that's in all of us. Brother Dave, if you come and lead us in a verse of song.